Hello, I'm Jason Cavadini, Grazing Outreach Specialist with UW Extension. Today we're at the Marshfield Agricultural Research Station outside of Stratford, just standing outside of the pastures, and we're going to be talking about stockpile grazing.
And I'm Michael Geisinger, Northwest Regional Outreach Specialist with the Nutrient and Pest Management Program. So Jason, you mentioned we're going to talk about stockpile grazing. What is stockpile grazing?
So basically, stockpile grazing is what it sounds like. We are stockpiling the forages in order to extend the grazing season as much as possible. So we know that for grazers, one of the benefits is the cheapest way of feeding our livestock is to bring them to it. And so as much as we can extend the grazing season as possible is to the benefit of the grazer. So usually around this time of year, late July, we start talking about preparing to stockpile those forages so we can continue grazing through fall, potentially even into early winter.
And why are we thinking about stockpile grazing around mid-July?
So typically we need about 60, even out to 80 days of regrowth, and it's really going to depend on the year. So we'll have to touch a little bit on how this year is different, but typically 60 days is sufficient of regrowth for stockpiling. But we know what the growth curves look like for grasses. Cool season grasses tend to slow down a little bit in the middle of the summer and then ramp up a little more toward the end, and so we're trying to take advantage of that, but it typically takes around 60 days to get enough to graze.
And why might this year be a little bit different, you mentioned?
Yeah, so this year we've been really moisture limited to the extent that our cool season grasses actually started going dormant. So after the first grazing or the first cutting of a lot of our grasses, they sat stagnant for 30, 40 plus days because we just didn't have enough moisture. And so that's all going to have to go into consideration this year. We're really going to have to weigh the trade-off. Do we feed something now in order to stockpile, or do we just continue grazing, understanding that we may not be able to stockpile as much as normal?
Yeah. And are there any nutrient considerations for this year's stockpile grazing?
Often farmers will put down a little bit of nitrogen just to make sure they get enough regrowth. That really is going to depend on the composition of the pasture. If there's plenty of legumes out there, that's not quite as critical. It still is a good idea to put a little bit out there. It almost always pays, but there's definitely such a thing as putting on more than you need, especially if there's a lot of legumes. Yeah. It's different if it's 100% grass, then we do need more nitrogen.
And where would someone go for more information on stockpile grazing?
So on the Extension website, there's a page for grazing, and we actually have a publication that has been put out in the last few months about stockpile grazing, and it sort of walks through that process of how to plan for stockpiling.
Great, and as always, feel free to contact the Extension educators serving your region for more.